I became involved in this area back in 2015, 2016 after I moved to inner city Melbourne, retired, got on a committee of a local community centre just to try and do my civic duties. There was a public housing estate next door, and one of the members of the committee was a public housing resident. And in the spirit of looking after our local neighbourhood, we got involved with also looking, getting involved with the issues that mattered for the public housing tenants nearby. I just thought it would be something fairly simple, bit of marketing and messaging and whatnot. But frankly, what I've seen terrifies me. It seems something that's been hijacked intentionally or unintentionally. And I do admit a lot of this can be unintentional, but the bottom line is there's human misery that's getting missed. There's a lot of activity and there's human misery getting missed. And that's my one and only reason why I'm now so crazy about working on this issue. And it needs policy change at the government, and it'll be good, because what I will do is very soon take you through all those confusing terms, because that's a lot of it's because of that confusing terminology, which quite conveniently has been taken advantage of by people who can stand to gain, again, intentionally and sometimes unintentionally. The human misery of housing in general, right now, there's a thing called a public housing register, or a housing register in Victoria. I had a look at it the other day, 64,000 applications on that register, which I estimate is about 116,000 human beings waiting for housing. There are also about 25,000 homeless people in Victoria. Not all of them sleeping rough. They may be in friends' places. Sadly, many in cars, and we've been hearing about that just recently down the Mornington Peninsula, as people will get onto that again, what causes that later. So we got 116,000 people on the register, 25,000 homeless, and many, if not most of those people will not be on the register. And also I know for a fact there are many people who have abandoned being on the register. They've given up. And the reason they've given up is, again, this was on the Victorian Public Tenants website just the other day. The waiting time for people with priority access to public housing is well over a year. And just in the recent period, according to the Budgetary Committee of the Victorian Government, so they're looking at the spending coming up, they're estimating that waiting time has increased by about 3 months, which seems crazy, because there's also stuff in the news I'll talk about later called the big housing build, and the government's busy building more housing. So why is the waiting time going out? And may I suggest the waiting time is going out because the people at the front of a list are getting zero attention. It's very simple, zero attention. And it comes about because there's been no net new public housing built in Victoria for 20 years. So if you're at the front of that list, you wait until someone moves out or departs this world, and then the house becomes available to you. And of course, while you're waiting, there are emergency cases that will be put ahead of you, quite rightly. And so there is this pool of people who are waiting forever to get into public housing, and they're sneaky, the government. They will find out that you're sleeping on a couch in a friend's house, and they will decrease your priority, because at least you've got something. So I guess they've got to make a hard decision. But this is the sort of rubbish that's going on. So how did this all start? Well, back in the Thatcher era in England, they got rid of council houses. Someone decided it was a great idea to privatise them, and it's something they've regretted ever since. Now, no one else has come out and said it here, but that is exactly what's happened here as well, is that in fact, the government has decided to privatise stuff. So I'll just put up a slide here, which just shows you the state of public housing in Australia. And good on you, Bob Hawke. He was a man who considered social welfare a very important thing. From 1981 through to 1991, he increased the percentage of public housing for all households from 4.9 to 7.1%. So that's a massive increase when you're looking at something like the population of Australia, which also was growing rapidly also in that decade. And then we have Paul Keating, who comes along, who believed in open markets, free enterprises, floating the Australian dollar, letting the market organise itself. And what's happened? The percentage of public housing, the money disappeared. And in 5 years, he managed to crank it down to 5.2%. And just FYI for your information, right now, the Australian penetration of public housing is about 4.2% of all of the population. And sadly, in the state of Victoria, it's 2.9%, which is the worst state by far in the country. So just thought I'd share that with you. So anyway, now getting back to my promise, let's go through the terminology. Okay, let me be clear. If you hear the words social housing, affordable housing, community housing, it's not public housing. If it's public housing, people will say the words public housing. So anyone who is using those other words, and I'll explain what they are in a moment, is a member of a population who's heard the term social housing and assumed it's more of a friendlier term for public housing, you know, because public housing has stigma. So they've invented a friendlier word called social housing. No. It's been invented to deceive the public, to hide from the public of what is going on. And the people who don't want you to know will continue to use the word social housing no matter how many times you beat them up, and ask them how much of that is public housing, how much of that is community housing, or whatever you're talking about. So let me be clear, public housing is public housing. You pay 25% of your income as rent, even if it's zero, but of course you'll have some basic income. And the security of tenure is there. You get to stay in the property where you're allocated, and you can also apply for transfers. There's another thing called community housing. Now, community housing is run by private businesses. They're not welfare, they're businesses. They charge up to 30% of your income as rent. And it's interesting, the Community Housing Industry Association brochure says they may also negotiate a higher rental. Also, you sign a lease of community housing, and if your income drops, sadly, you're stuck with whatever you signed the lease on until the lease gets renegotiated. So it's not just 25% of your income as it goes dynamically. It's very much a different world. Also in community housing, the tenants report quite often that they get charged sundries, levies, cleaning fees, whatever. I can see people nodding. So this is another way where you start paying more than your 30%. And just to let you know also that the government also has a thing called Commonwealth Rent Assistance that they will provide or pay directly to the community housing provider, which is usually about $70 a week as well. And that's just purely, you know, from the rental tenant's point of view. Let's be clear though, these are businesses that they have plans based around profitability. Being not for profits, profitability would be more not making a loss. But I also love reading the annual reports of many community housing businesses, and they have this thing called retained earnings. Sounds like a profit to me. And of course, they use these retained earnings to go and buy more properties, because one of the business goals of a community housing organisation, and you see it often, is this thing called asset growth. Not the sort of stuff that exactly interests someone who's desperate for public housing. But this, let me tell you, is what people are talking about almost every time they talk about social housing. The social housing is purely, I call it a weasel word to hide behind about what is really going on. People are talking about community housing. Now, I love watching press conferences. I guess during COVID, we all watched a few conferences, didn't we? You know, but maybe that's where I got the habit. But then I watched also the conferences during the last election campaign, and we all heard the story of Anthony Albanese, the public housing, the boy from public housing. They all talked public housing, and I saw Anthony Albanese choke because he said, and that is why Labor has a policy for more social housing. And he's almost said the word public housing, and he realised they're not building any public housing. They have a policy for no public housing. And so he was talking about, I grew up eating oranges and we're now going to grow apples for everyone. Something totally different. So that's what community housing is. And social housing is actually, it was gazetted, or they changed the Housing Act in Victoria for it to mean the umbrella term for for public and community housing. So you add the two together, and we call it social housing. It was very hard to understand then when someone makes an announcement about the big housing build. We're going to build 12,000 social housing properties. And you go, how much of that is public housing? Now, Ellen Sandell from the Greens stood up in Parliament and actually went through what I've just done, probably in a much nicer way, about the misleading term social housing, and asked the question, how much of the big housing build is public housing and how much of it is community housing? In other words, privatised housing. Never got an answer. But we know, and I'll show you a table from the big housing build later, it's community housing. It is not public housing. And the government, in fact, had a input to its 10-year housing inquiry, and they said in there, part of the briefing paper to people wanting to do inputs, that there is no future for public housing in Victoria other than maintaining the properties. Okay, give you an idea of sizes. Depending on who's doing the counting, and it's a terrible area for counting numbers, it's about 64,000 properties in Victoria are public housing properties. Only about 10% of those are the visible ones that we all see in the towers. So there's a heck of a lot of units and houses, and I know people doing this and people living in their own standalone houses or in a unit in the middle of a complex, which are rented or bought or owned by Housing Victoria, and public housing tenants lived in there. So it's like the towers, don't start imagining that public housing is just towers. It's not. In terms of the volume of community housing around the place, the community housing industry, I actually got this number from them, very different from how the government counts it. But anyway, I'll give the industry's number, and they said there was 11,700 community housing properties back in 2009, and that number went up to 19,200 properties in 2019. So we had, you know, a fair increase in the number of properties over a decade for community housing. And if I didn't say it before, that number in public housing stays a constant. You know, the graph is just a straight line in terms of the number of properties. And so one sort of starts wondering, well, who is getting into this community housing? Because hang on, you know, there's all these people on the waiting list and it's getting longer. Well, what they're doing is they're choosing to make offers to tenants from the back of the list or the middle of the list, you know, in terms of income. And that helps their profitability. I mean, the range of the housing register goes from public housing, you can be $31,000 a year income, up to $54,000 if you're in a couple. But in terms of community housing, this goes all the way up to $86,000 a year, or if you've got 2 kids, $116,000 a year. So if I'm running a public housing business, I'd rather have 30% of a bigger income. That makes sense. And look, admittedly, I'm also running a business. I've got different costs, you know, so, you know, and there are some public housing organisations which have got incredibly good hearts. So I'm not, don't let me just say, you know, I'm just tarring you know, everyone with the same brush. But the fact is that this is where the damage is happening to the people waiting for public housing, is that the money's going elsewhere. Now, it's also interesting that a fair amount of the community housing hasn't been built by them or bought by them. It's been transferred to them by the government. So the government has also been deliberately transferring properties, in some cases retaining ownership and getting the community housing organisation to just manage the property, or in some cases just the whole lot goes over. There's some pretty strange things going on in politics, but I guess it's all driven by some pretty strange discussions they don't do in public, but in the corridors of power, which sadly volunteer activists in public housing don't get to see. Now, there's another term that gets thrown around, the last term, affordable housing. It's often social and affordable housing. Now, affordable housing is most probably community housing, yet again, just in another disguise. The formal definition is housing rented at 80% of market rate. And there are a number of schemes that have come along over the years that have, you know, targeted that market. And having a look at it, most of the organisations involved in this have been community housing businesses taking advantage of it. One of the schemes was the Rudd era global financial crisis. They came up with a scheme called National Rental Affordability Scheme for affordable housing. So if developers would build a house in conjunction with someone else and rent it at 80% of market rate, the government under this scheme, under the Kevin Rudd scheme, would give the developer $11,000 per dwelling per year for 10 years. So that's $110,000 kickback for the rent they're foregoing, basically. It only came out recently. The Grattan Institute actually did a report on this, and it turned out the average loss that the developers were making was about $4,000. They were getting $11,000 compensation just in case, but the actual average was only $4,000. So they're all getting a windfall of $7,000 per property. And I can guarantee you they all knew that. These are developers. And this is the sort of stuff that all, you know, this is what public housing dollars are chasing, is stuff like this going on. Now, Tony Abbott caught a sniff of this when he came into power. So the scheme was ended in 2014. but we're still seeing the remnants of 10 years of some of these properties still coming through until 2024. Grattan said we lost about $4 billion as a country on this scheme. Windfall to developers. The total number of properties built was estimated about 38,000, of which about 19,000 were developed by community housing businesses. So, you know, half of it was just straight developers, but there you were, community housing was in there as well. So, have you gotten over social and affordable housing yet? It's not public housing, but the public think it is. So, and that's why we've got a housing crisis. There's no public housing being done. And look, people will say, oh, look, Jack, there's room for both. You know, there are people further back in the list who can afford it. Yeah, well, you know, like, but I don't think there's room for both when there's public money going through this. I'm happy for these organisations to survive on their own skills, business skills, but until we get rid of that public housing queue and also provide public housing to everyone who deserves it, I don't think we should be giving 1 cent of government money to anyone else. It's a thing they call neoliberalism if you study politics. It's where a government basically outsources policy to private companies and lobbyists who produce the best business case. And, you know, and this is, I guess this is my little speech against privatisation. And we've seen the damage of that just in terms of utilities recently. And roads and Transurban and, you know, and all these people building tunnels everywhere, which we'll then pay tolls for the next 40 years. They're all great at making money, these people, because I've got to tell you, if it's been privatised, someone's making money. I will make another mention on affordable housing, because some people who are trying to buy a house are also saying housing is not affordable. Now, we're really talking about rental housing, we're talking public housing. But in terms of people struggling to buy something, I mean, a lot of the high prices in housing is because it's seen as an investment. It's a way of making money, and it's negative gearing and discounted capital gains tax that make that sort of thing happen. However, we have seen some stuff come out recently from the government in terms of schemes for people to be able to buy a house, such as the government will actually buy or pay for 40% of the price of a house for eligible applicants. And they will also subsidise the discount so that the people only pay 5% of the purchase price of the property. The catch is when the house gets sold or property gets sold, it has to be paid back at the market rate. So if it's made a profit, the government also gets its share. And it's sort of estimated if property was going up like it has been, people will probably never be able to even buy that. They would have to sell it and just, you know, salvage whatever. And the other very strong opinion is that it just increases the market demand and drives prices even further. But I don't want to get into a political debate because that's what our two major parties more or less were looking at, ways of helping people buy new houses, which is not the discussion today. I'll also mention crisis and emergency accommodation. That's not public housing. That's temporary stuff for crisis and emergency. It's a lot of that. There's almost zero government presence in there. It's churches, charities. That's sort of the base where a lot of these have come from. And I've got to say, it's pretty rough. I mean, there's a friend of mine called Sandy I met a few years ago, homeless lady, and you know, she got an overnight accommodation in a well-known crisis accommodation provider. I mean, these guys have fancy glossy brochures. They get a lot of government subsidies as well. And she said, Jack, I moved out. I'd rather be on the street than in there, because in there you get robbed. If you're a female, you're a danger. Pretty rough stuff going on there, massively mismanaged, and a lot of subsidies being gathered from the government. So and don't let me talk about during COVID, because I hear they were actually double stacking some rooms to make even more money.